Harold Williams dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against the deck of his fishing boat as he stared through salt-crusted binoculars at the impossible sight before him. 3 miles offshore in the churning waters of the Outer Banks, a German shepherd was swimming alone, its desperate howls cutting through the morning wind like a blade through his weathered heart. This wasn't a dog that had fallen overboard. This was a dog on a mission. The animal's powerful strokes fought against swells that would challenge an Olympic swimmer, amber eyes locked on Hank's boat with an intelligence that made his spine crawl. Behind the dog, storm clouds gathered like God's own fury, Hurricane Delilah bearing down on the Carolina coast with murderous intent. Hank's arthritic hands trembled as he reached for the wheel, his pacemaker hammering against his ribs. 43 years on these waters had taught him to read signs, and every instinct screamed that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. What had driven this dog into the ocean, and who was dying while he watched? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The dog's frantic swimming triggered something deep in Harold Hank Williams's chest, not his damaged heart, but the part of him that had spent 30 years pulling drowning souls from these same waters. At 68, the retired Coast Guard veteran should have been home nursing his morning coffee and pretending Margaret's empty chair didn't still break him in half every sunrise. Instead, he was 3 miles offshore in his battered fishing boat, staring at a German shepherd who swam like his life depended on reaching civilization. "Easy there, boy," Hank called, his voice rusty from 2 years of talking mostly to himself. Since Margaret passed, whole days slipped by where the only conversations he held were with her photograph on the kitchen counter, asking what she'd want for dinner before remembering she'd never answer again. The financial vultures had been circling ever since the medical bills started piling up. $47,000 for Margaret's final 3 months at the memory care facility, money that had evaporated their savings faster than morning mist. The bank notice sitting on his kitchen table gave him 30 days before they foreclosed on the house he'd called home for 4 decades. At his age, starting over meant sleeping in his truck. His son Tommy lived 8 hours away in Virginia Beach. Their relationship strained to breaking after Tommy's gambling addiction had cost the family another $50,000. "I can't keep bailing you out," Hank had said during their last phone call 6 months ago. Tommy's response still echoed, "When did I become such a disappointment to you, Dad?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun nobody wanted to fire. The German shepherd's howls grew more desperate as Hank maneuvered closer. This wasn't random. The animal's amber eyes held intelligence and purpose that sent chills down his weathered spine. The dog's expensive leather collar suggested an owner with means, someone who cared enough to invest in quality gear. But what kind of person brought their dog this far offshore? Hurricane Delilah's outer bands were already stirring the water into 6-foot swells. The Weather Service had been broadcasting warnings all morning. Category 3 storm, landfall expected in 18 hours, mandatory evacuations for all barrier islands. Smart folks were already battening down or heading inland. Only fools and desperate men stayed on the water when Mother Nature flexed her muscles. Hank checked his fuel gauge, enough to venture further out and still make it back to harbor, assuming the weather held. His heart medication sat in the wheelhouse, 3 pills he'd hidden from Tommy during their last visit. "Don't want to be a burden," he'd muttered to Margaret's photo that morning, the same excuse he'd been using to avoid doctor visits for months. The dog suddenly changed direction, swimming with renewed purpose toward the barrier islands. Hank followed that intelligent gaze and spotted something that made his blood run cold. A thin column of smoke rising from what should have been an abandoned research station. Someone was out there, trapped on an island about to be swallowed by the storm. The German shepherd collapsed onto Hank's deck with a sound that would haunt him for months. The wet thud of a creature who had pushed beyond every physical limit. Steam rose from the dog's massive frame as Hank wrapped him in the wool blanket Margaret had knitted during her final winter, back when her hands still remembered how to create beautiful things. "There now, fella," Hank murmured, running calloused hands over the animal's coat, checking for injuries. The dog's breathing was labored but steady, his amber eyes never leaving Hank's face. Around his neck, a leather collar bore a single name engraved in bold letters: Ranger. But it was what Hank found clipped to the collar that made his chest tighten, a waterproof medical alert tag and something else that stopped his heart cold. A small laminated photograph of a young boy, maybe 8 years old, with bright blue eyes and a gap-toothed grin. On the back, in careful feminine handwriting, "Michael Sullivan, age 8. If found, please call Kate." The phone number was partially worn away by salt water, but Hank could make out enough digits to know it was local. More troubling was the date on the photo, 3 years old. This wasn't a recent family pet. This was a dog carrying the ghost of a child. Ranger struggled to his feet with the determination of a soldier reporting for duty. Instead of seeking comfort or food, he moved immediately to the bow, staring with laser focus toward the barrier islands. A low whine escaped his throat, building to a howl that seemed to carry the weight of desperate communication. "What is it, boy?" Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The dog's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Ranger pawed at the gunwale, his powerful body trembling with urgency rather than exhaustion. Everything in his posture screamed of someone in mortal danger, someone who needed help that only Hank could provide. Following Ranger's frantic direction, Hank guided his boat toward Pine Island Research Station, a facility that had been officially abandoned for 2 years. The narrow channel leading to the island's dock was treacherous even in calm weather, lined with submerged pilings and shifting sandbars that could gut a boat in seconds. As they approached, Hank spotted a figure on the dock, a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair sitting motionless at the edge of the pier. Even from a distance, something about her posture struck him as wrong. She wasn't fishing or waiting for rescue. She was sitting like someone who had given up on everything. "Ma'am!" Hank called as he maneuvered closer. "Ma'am, you need to evacuate! Hurricane's coming!" The woman turned slowly, and Hank's breath caught. Dr. Catherine Sullivan looked like she was staring through him from another world entirely. Her clothes were neat, but somehow wrong for the situation. A light sundress instead of storm gear, sandals instead of boots. Most disturbing were her eyes, blue as summer sky but empty as winter graves. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had already made peace with death. "Please just take Ranger and go." That's when Hank noticed the waterproof bag beside her, and his heart sank. Even from the boat, he could see the corner of what looked like a letter sticking out. The kind of letter people wrote when they didn't plan to see tomorrow. "Ma'am, I'm Harold Williams. This is my boat, and I'm not leaving without both of you." He tied off to the dock with hands that had secured countless rescue lines. "That storm's going to hit in 18 hours, and this island will be underwater." Kate's laugh was bitter as Atlantic wind. "That's rather the point, Mr. Williams. My son Michael drowned here 3 years ago. It seems appropriate." Ranger whined urgently, moving between Kate and the water's edge. The dog's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. He wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian specifically trained to prevent exactly this scenario. "Dr. Sullivan," Hank said carefully, reading the name from her medical tag. "I don't know what pain you're carrying, but that dog of yours swam 3 miles through rough seas to find help. You gonna make his sacrifice meaningless?" "He doesn't understand," Kate replied, her voice breaking. "He's just an animal doing what he was trained to do." "Lady, that animal has more sense than both of us combined." Hank stepped onto the dock despite his protesting knees. "He knows love when he sees it, and he knows you're worth saving even if you don't." The first drops of rain began to fall as Hurricane Delilah's outer bands reached the coast. In the distance, thunder rolled like God clearing his throat before delivering judgment. They had hours, not days, to figure out how to save a woman who didn't want to be saved and a dog who wouldn't survive watching her die. The photograph changed everything. Hank found it wedged behind a loose board in the research station's main room, where Kate had apparently been living for the past week. A faded snapshot of a young boy with bright eyes and an infectious grin, standing next to a much younger version of Kate in what was clearly a veterinary clinic. But it was the handwritten note on the back that made Hank's weathered hands tremble. Danny Williams, age 6. Full recovery after emergency surgery. Thank you for saving my grandson's life. The Williams family. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Hank whispered, sinking into a folding chair as the full weight of recognition hit him like a rogue wave. Kate looked up from where she sat by the window, watching Ranger pace the small room with military precision. "What is it?" "You," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the veterinarian who saved Danny?" "My grandson. 5 years ago when that drunk driver—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of that phone call from Tommy still woke him in cold sweats. "Dad, Danny's hurt bad. They don't think he's going to make it." Kate's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching recognition, then immediately back to hollow emptiness. "I don't remember much from those years. After Michael died, everything before became fuzzy." "You operated for 12 hours straight," Hank continued, standing and moving toward her with the photograph. "Tommy called me crying, said the doctors wanted to put Danny down, but this lady vet refused to give up, said she'd seen worse cases pull through." His voice cracked. "You gave my family hope when there wasn't any left to give." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here sat the woman who had saved his grandson's life, planning to end her own in the same waters that had claimed her child. Hank felt the cosmic weight of debt and obligation pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the research station's windows with increasing violence. Hurricane Delilah was moving faster than predicted, and the weather radio crackled with updated warnings. All coastal evacuations must be completed within the next 12 hours. After that point, emergency services will be suspended until after the storm passes. "Kate," Hank said, using her first name for the first time, "I owe you everything. My grandson is alive because you wouldn't quit on him. Now it's my turn to not quit on you." But Kate's response revealed the depth of her psychological wounds. "You don't understand what I did. Michael was playing on this very dock while I was inside, distracted by a phone call about some research grant. When I came out, he was gone. Just gone." Tears streamed down her face. "I let my own child drown because I cared more about my career than watching him." Ranger suddenly appeared at Kate's side, pressing his massive head against her leg with the practiced motion of a trained therapy animal. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. And Hank began to understand that this German shepherd wasn't just a pet. He was Kate's lifeline, specifically trained to prevent exactly what she was planning. "That dog swam 3 miles to find me," Hank said quietly. "Not because he was lost, but because he knew you needed help. He's been watching you plan this, hasn't he? That's why he brought me here." The first real crack appeared in Kate's emotional armor as she looked down at Ranger's loyal face. "He won't leave my side, even when I try to. When I sit too close to the water, he pulls me back." Thunder crashed overhead, and through the window they could see Hank's boat straining against its dock lines as the waves grew larger. Time was running out, and they all knew it. The bridge was their lifeline, and it was dying. Hank stood at the edge of the narrow wooden structure that connected Pine Island to the mainland. watching support beams strain under the assault of Hurricane Delilah's advance winds. What had been a sturdy crossing that morning now groaned and swayed like an arthritic old man trying to stand in a gale. "We need to go now," Hank called back to the research station, where Kate was gathering what she claimed were important documents, but which Hank suspected were final letters to people she'd never see again. "That bridge won't hold much longer." Ranger paced between them, his anxiety palpable as he sensed the growing danger. The German shepherd's training was evident in every movement. He positioned himself to block Kate's access to the water while keeping visual contact with Hank. This wasn't random dog behavior. This was a precisely trained animal executing a suicide prevention protocol. "Kate, whatever you're doing in there, it needs to wait," Hank shouted, as another gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The storm was accelerating faster than any weather model had predicted, and the radio in his boat had been broadcasting increasingly desperate updates. "All evacuation routes will be impassable within 6 hours. This is your final warning." When Kate finally emerged from the station, she wasn't carrying documents. In her hands was a small wooden box, weathered by salt air and obviously precious. "Michael's things," she explained simply, clutching it to her chest like a life preserver. "I can't leave them." The trio made it halfway across the bridge before disaster struck. A massive wind gust, easily 70 miles per hour, hit the structure broadside. The ancient timbers shrieked in protest, and Hank felt the entire bridge shift beneath their feet. Behind them, one of the support posts snapped with a sound like a gunshot. "Run!" Hank yelled, grabbing Kate's arm and pulling her forward. But as they reached the three-quarter mark, the bridge gave a final, apocalyptic groan and collapsed behind them, taking with it their only escape route. They were trapped on Pine Island with Hurricane Delilah bearing down like the wrath of God. "My boat," Hank panted as they stumbled to safety on the mainland side. "We can take my boat around to the lee side of the island, wait out the worst of it there." But when they reached the harbor, Hank's heart sank. His fishing boat, Margaret's Dream, was taking a beating from the increasingly violent waves. Even worse, 2 other boats had broken free from their moorings and were drifting toward his vessel like battering rams. "She won't survive in open water," Kate observed, her veterinary training allowing her to assess the situation with clinical detachment. "The waves are already 8 feet and building. In a boat that size, we'd be swamped within minutes." It was then that Ranger did something extraordinary. The German shepherd trotted to a storage shed near the dock and began barking urgently at a specific corner. When Hank investigated, he found a cache of emergency supplies that someone had stored years ago. Life vests, emergency radios, and most importantly, a detailed map of the island's emergency shelter system. "There," Kate said, pointing to a marking on the map. "The old Coast Guard bunker. It's built into the bedrock, designed to withstand Category 5 storms. We can ride it out there." The bunker was a mile inland, accessible only by an overgrown trail that wound through dense maritime forest. As they hiked through increasingly violent wind and rain, Kate began to open up about the night Michael died. "I wasn't on a phone call about research," she confessed, shouting over the storm. "That was a lie I told the investigators, the newspapers, everyone. I was actually calling my ex-husband, begging him to take Michael for the weekend because I was having thoughts." She stopped walking, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. "I was having thoughts about hurting myself, and I didn't trust myself to be alone with him." Hank felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "You were trying to protect him. I stepped inside to make the call so he wouldn't hear me crying. When I came back out, he was gone. The dock was empty." Kate's voice broke completely. "I spent 3 years thinking I failed him because I was selfish. But the truth is, I failed him because I was already broken." Ranger suddenly stopped and growled, his hackles rising. Through the storm, they could hear something that chilled them to the bone. The sound of other people in distress. voices calling for help, somewhere ahead in the forest. They found them huddled in a depression between two fallen trees. An elderly couple, probably in their 70s, soaked and clearly suffering from exposure. The woman was barely conscious, and the man was desperately trying to keep her warm with his own body heat. "Please," the man called when he saw them approach. "My wife needs help. We tried to evacuate, but our car got swept off the road by storm surge. We've been walking for hours." Without hesitation, Kate dropped to her knees beside the woman and began a rapid assessment. Her medical training, dormant for 3 years, roared back to life with stunning clarity. "She's hypothermic and possibly in shock. We need to get her warm and dry immediately." "The bunker's only half a mile ahead," Hank said, already calculating. "But she can't walk in this condition." It was Ranger who provided the solution. The German shepherd positioned himself beside the unconscious woman and lowered his body, clearly offering himself as a living stretcher. With Kate supporting the woman's head and Hank taking her feet, they managed to create a makeshift rescue formation with Ranger providing crucial stability in the middle. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Hank's life. His heart hammered against his ribs as they fought through wind that threatened to knock them flat and rain that turned the trail into a river of mud. Kate maintained constant medical monitoring of their patient while simultaneously providing encouragement that kept the elderly man moving forward. "What's her name?" Kate called to the husband. "Dorothy," he replied, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Dorothy Peterson. We've been married 53 years. "Dorothy, I'm Dr. Kate Sullivan," she said directly into the woman's ear, even though Dorothy appeared unconscious. "You're going to be fine. We're taking you somewhere safe, and your husband is right here with you." When they finally reached the Coast Guard bunker, Hank understood why it had been chosen as an emergency shelter. Built into solid granite and reinforced with steel, it was designed to be humanity's middle finger to whatever Mother Nature could throw at it. Inside, they found basic supplies: blankets, fresh water, emergency rations, and most critically, a medical kit that Kate immediately put to use, treating Dorothy's hypothermia. "Her pulse is getting stronger," Kate announced after 20 minutes of intensive care. "Body temperature's coming up. She's going to make it." As Dorothy Peterson opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her husband, Hank watched something fundamental shift in Kate's expression. For the first time in 3 years, she was saving a life instead of planning to end one. "You still have it," he told her quietly. "That gift you used to save Danny. It never left you." Outside, Hurricane Delilah roared with the fury of a living thing, but inside the bunker something like hope was beginning to bloom. They were trapped, cut off from the outside world, facing a night that might be their last. But for the first time since Michael's death, Kate Sullivan was fighting to preserve life instead of planning to destroy it. Ranger settled between Kate and Dorothy, his professional instinct satisfied that both his charges were safe. The German shepherd had completed his mission. He'd brought help to someone who needed it, even if that someone didn't know she needed it yet. Hurricane Delilah hit Pine Island like the fist of an angry god at 3:17 a.m. The Coast Guard bunker, built to withstand Category 5 storms, shuddered under the assault as winds exceeding 140 miles per hour turned trees into projectiles and reduced buildings to kindling. Inside, 5 souls and 1 devoted German shepherd huddled in the artificial twilight of emergency lighting, listening to the world tear itself apart above their heads. Dorothy Peterson had stabilized under Kate's care, but her husband Harold, who insisted everyone call him Pete, was showing signs of cardiac distress. The stress of the evacuation, combined with his age and existing heart condition, had pushed his body beyond its limits. Kate monitored his pulse with growing concern while Hank shared his own heart medication, a gesture that spoke volumes about the bonds forming between strangers in crisis. "Chest pain's getting worse," Pete whispered, clutching his left arm. "Dorothy, if something happens to me—" "Nothing's happening to you," Kate said firmly, her medical authority cutting through his fear like a scalpel. "You've got 53 years invested in that woman. She's going to need you when this storm passes." But privately, Kate knew they were facing a medical emergency with no way to summon help. It was Ranger who alerted them to the first real crisis. The German shepherd suddenly stood alert, his ears pricked toward a sound that human ears couldn't detect. Then they all heard it, the unmistakable crack of structural failure somewhere in the bunker's upper levels. "Water," Hank said grimly, pointing to a thin stream that had begun trickling down the far wall. "Storm surge is overtopping the island. We're about to find out just how waterproof this place really is." Within 20 minutes, it became clear that the bunker's seal had been compromised. Water was entering through multiple breaches, and the ancient drainage system couldn't handle the volume. The lower level, where they had taken shelter, was slowly but steadily flooding. "We need to move to the upper chamber," Kate decided, but moving Pete in his condition would be extremely dangerous. The stairs are narrow and steep. If he has a full cardiac event halfway up— That's when Hank made a decision that would define the rest of the night. "You take Pete and Dorothy up first. Get them settled. Ranger and I will gather the supplies and follow." "Hank, no," Kate protested, understanding immediately what he was really saying. "We all go together or nobody goes." "Dr. Sullivan," Hank replied with the calm authority of a man who had spent 30 years making life or death decisions at sea, "you're the medical professional here. Those folks need you. That dog needs you. And I need to know you're all safe before I worry about myself." The water was ankle deep now and rising fast. Kate helped Pete to his feet while Dorothy, despite her own weakness, insisted on walking under her own power. "53 years I've been taking care of this stubborn man," she said with a wan smile. "I'm not stopping now." As they made their way up the narrow stairs, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that Hank was making a noble sacrifice. The old fisherman's heart condition was worse than he'd admitted. She could see it in his labored breathing, the slight blue tinge to his lips, the way he pressed his hand to his chest when he thought no one was looking. The upper chamber was drier but smaller, with barely enough room for all of them. Through the reinforced windows they could see the full fury of Hurricane Delilah, trees bent horizontal, debris flying past like bullets, and storm surge that had turned Pine Island into a temporary lake. "Radio's dead," Hank reported, trying the emergency communications equipment. "Antenna must have been torn off." For the next 4 hours they rode out the storm's peak intensity. Pete's condition worsened steadily, despite Kate's best efforts, and she found herself facing the terrible possibility that she might watch another person die because she couldn't save them. The parallel to Michael's drowning was inescapable. Once again, she was powerless to prevent tragedy. It was Dorothy who provided the breakthrough, grabbing Kate's hand during Pete's worst moment and speaking with surprising strength. "Doctor, I can see the guilt eating you alive. Whatever happened to your child, whatever you think you did wrong, don't let it stop you from saving my husband. He needs you to believe in yourself the way that wonderful dog believes in you." Ranger, as if summoned by Dorothy's words, moved to Kate's side and placed his massive head on her knee. The German shepherd's amber eyes held a wisdom that transcended species, and in that moment Kate felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite healing, but the first crack in the wall of self-hatred she'd built around her heart. Drawing on reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed, Kate improvised a cardiac stabilization protocol using only the limited supplies in the emergency kit. She positioned Pete to optimize blood flow, administered aspirin to thin his blood, and used a combination of breathing exercises and pressure points to manage his pain. "You're going to be okay," she told him with growing conviction. Your heart is strong, it just needs time to adjust to the stress. As dawn broke over a devastated landscape, the storm's eye passed directly overhead, providing a brief window of supernatural calm. Through the bunker's windows, they could see the extent of the destruction. Pine Island had been scoured nearly clean, with only the sturdiest structures still standing. Hank's boat was gone. The research station was reduced to scattered timbers, and the bridge that had connected them to the mainland existed only in memory. But they were alive. All of them. "Coast Guard will be flying reconnaissance as soon as it's safe," Hank said, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "Problem is, this bunker is designed to be invisible from the air. They might not spot us for days." That's when Ranger demonstrated once again why German Shepherds had earned their reputation as the most intelligent working dogs on Earth. The animal trotted to the emergency supply cache and began nosing through the equipment until he found what he was looking for, a signal mirror and emergency flares. "Smart boy," Kate breathed, understanding immediately. "He knows we need to signal for rescue." As Pete's condition continued to stabilize and Dorothy regained more of her strength, Kate found herself thinking not about ending her life, but about rebuilding it. The past 12 hours had reminded her of something she'd forgotten in her grief. She was a healer. It wasn't just her profession. It was her calling, as fundamental to her identity as breathing. "Hank," she said quietly as they prepared the signal equipment, "when we get out of here, I want to do something meaningful. Maybe start a program for emergency medical response in coastal communities or trauma counseling for people who've lost children to accidents." Hank smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Dr. Sullivan, I think that sounds like exactly the kind of work the world needs more of." Outside, Hurricane Delilah was preparing for her final assault. But inside the bunker, hope was taking root in the most unlikely soil. The silence was worse than the storm. When Hurricane Delilah's eye wall finally passed and the winds died to an eerie whisper, the absence of sound felt like death itself had settled over Pine Island. From the bunker's reinforced windows, they could see a landscape transformed into an alien wasteland. Trees stripped bare and snapped like matchsticks, buildings erased as if they had never existed, and everywhere the smell of salt and destruction. But it was what they couldn't see that terrified them most. No boats on the horizon, no helicopters overhead, no signs of human life beyond their small concrete tomb. "Radio's completely dead," Hank announced after his 15th attempt to raise the Coast Guard. "Storm must have taken out the repeater towers." His voice carried a forced calm that fooled no one, least of all himself. They all understood what this meant. Without communication, rescue teams had no way of knowing anyone had survived on Pine Island. Pete Peterson's condition had deteriorated rapidly once the adrenaline of survival wore off. Despite Kate's best efforts, his cardiac distress was worsening, and their makeshift medical supplies were woefully inadequate for the crisis he was facing. His breathing had become shallow and labored, his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and Dorothy's eyes held the terrible knowledge that her husband of 53 years was slipping away. "I need real medical equipment," Kate said quietly to Hank, pulling him aside. "Cardiac medication, oxygen, a defibrillator. Without them, he's not going to last another 24 hours. "How long do we have?" Hank asked, though they both knew he was really asking when Pete would die. "Hours, not days." Kate's clinical training warred with her emotional exhaustion. "Maybe 6 hours, if we're lucky." "Probably less." Hank stared out at the devastated landscape, calculating odds with the grim precision of a man who had spent 30 years in search and rescue. No communication meant no way to call for help. No boats meant no way to reach the mainland. No helicopter sounds meant the Coast Guard wasn't conducting immediate rescue operations, probably because they assumed no one could have survived the storm on the barrier islands. "We have to try the flares," he decided. "Even if there's only a slim chance someone will see them." They used 3 precious emergency flares that afternoon, sending them arcing high above the island at carefully spaced intervals. Each red burst of light represented hope launched into an empty sky, and each one faded without response. The signal mirror caught the afternoon sun perfectly, sending Morse code distress signals toward the mainland with mechanical precision, but the horizon remained stubbornly empty. As evening approached, Pete Peterson made the decision that would break all their hearts. "Dorothy, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I need you to listen to me." "Don't you dare," Dorothy replied fiercely, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Don't you dare give up on me now, Harold Peterson." "I'm not giving up," Pete said with a sad smile. "I'm being practical. That young doctor and old fisherman can't waste their energy trying to save a man who's already dying. They need to focus on keeping you alive until help comes." Kate felt something shatter inside her chest. Here was a man facing death with dignity and grace, asking her to let him go so she could save his wife. It was Michael all over again, someone she cared about slipping away while she stood helpless, watching life ebb away despite all her medical knowledge. "I won't stop fighting for you," she told Pete firmly. "I couldn't save my son, but I can damn well try to save you." "Doctor," Pete replied gently, "sometimes the kindest thing a healer can do is know when to stop healing and start comforting." That night, as Pete's breathing became increasingly irregular, and Dorothy held his hand while singing the old hymns they'd shared for 5 decades, Kate experienced a psychological break that had been building for 3 years. She couldn't save Michael, she couldn't save Pete. She couldn't even save herself from the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had driven her to this island in the first place. Every patient she'd ever lost came flooding back, the animals she couldn't heal, the families she'd disappointed, the promises she'd made and broken. "I should have died in that water with my son," she whispered to Hank as they kept vigil. "I should have followed him down and saved everyone the trouble of watching me fail again and again." Hank had no answer for her pain because he was drowning in his own. His heart medication was gone, used to help Pete. His chest pains were worsening by the hour. At 68, with no rescue in sight and no way to communicate their location, he was facing the very real possibility that they would all die on this godforsaken island. But it was Ranger who refused to accept defeat. The sound of rotor blades cutting through morning air was so faint that Hank almost dismissed it as wishful thinking. But Ranger's ears pricked forward with laser focus, and the German shepherd's sudden alertness made everyone in the bunker freeze with desperate hope. "Helicopter," Hank breathed, scrambling toward the window with energy he didn't know he still possessed. "Military birds, flying search patterns." Through the reinforced glass, they could see 2 Coast Guard helicopters sweeping the coastline in methodical grid patterns, but they were still miles away and moving parallel to the shore rather than toward the island. Without the emergency beacon that had been destroyed in the storm, Pine Island was just another piece of debris-covered land that appeared uninhabited from the air. "They'll never see us from here," Kate said, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had stopped believing in miracles. Pete Peterson had died 2 hours before dawn, passing peacefully in Dorothy's arms while they all watched helplessly. The weight of another death, another failure, had pushed Kate back toward the psychological abyss she'd been trying to escape. But as the helicopters began to fade into the distance, something extraordinary happened. Ranger suddenly bolted from the bunker, racing down the stairs and out into the devastated landscape with purpose that defied his own exhaustion. Through the window they watched in amazement as the German shepherd positioned himself on the highest point of debris he could find and began barking with a volume and intensity that seemed to shake the very air. "He's signaling them," Dorothy whispered, wonder replacing grief in her voice. "That dog is trying to save us all." Hank grabbed the signal mirror and began flashing SOS patterns toward the distant aircraft while Kate gathered their remaining flares. But it was Ranger's relentless barking, a sound that carried for miles across the water, that finally caught the attention of the search crews. One helicopter broke from its pattern and began flying directly toward Pine Island. "They see us," Hank said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Dear God, they actually see us." As the Coast Guard helicopter circled the island, looking for a safe landing zone among the debris, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the possibility of a future beyond her grief. But with that hope came a revelation that would change everything. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through an external speaker. "This is Lieutenant Thomas Williams, U.S. Coast Guard. Are there survivors down there?" Hank's face went white as ocean foam. "Tommy," he whispered, recognizing his son's voice despite 3 years of estrangement. "That's my boy." The reunion that followed was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Tommy Williams had been flying search and rescue missions for 18 hours straight, pulling survivors from impossible situations when he heard the emergency call about possible survivors on Pine Island. He had no idea his own father was among them until he saw Hank's familiar figure waving from the debris field. "Dad?" Tommy's voice over the radio was thick with disbelief. "Dad, what the hell are you doing out there?" "Long story, son," Hank replied into the rescue radio they'd lowered. "Right now, we need medical evacuation for an elderly woman and a lady who's been through hell. And there's a German Shepherd down here who deserves a medal." But as the rescue operation unfolded, Kate experienced the psychological breakthrough that had been building since she'd first saved Dorothy Peterson's life. Watching Hank reunite with his son, seeing the raw emotion and forgiveness that flowed between them despite years of conflict, she finally understood something crucial about grief and guilt. "I've been punishing myself for surviving when Michael didn't," she told Dorothy as they waited for the rescue basket. "But Michael didn't die because I was a bad mother. He died because sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and no amount of self-hatred will bring them back." Dorothy, despite her own fresh grief, took Kate's hands in hers. "Honey, that boy of yours would want you to live, just like my Pete would want me to keep going. The question is, what are you going to do with the life you've been given?" The medical helicopter that arrived to transport Dorothy revealed another shock that sent Kate's emotional journey in an entirely new direction. The flight medic who jumped down to assess Dorothy was Dr. Marcus Reed, Kate's former colleague from the veterinary hospital where she'd once worked. "Kate Sullivan?" Marcus said in amazement. "We thought you were dead. You disappeared 3 years ago, and no one could find you." "I've been hiding," Kate admitted as they prepared Dorothy for transport, "from everything and everyone." "Kate, there's something you need to know," Marcus said urgently as they loaded Dorothy into the helicopter. "About Michael's death. The investigation was reopened last year. New evidence came to light." Kate's world tilted on its axis. "What kind of evidence?" "Security camera footage from a marina camera that wasn't discovered during the original investigation. Kate, it shows everything. Michael didn't fall off the dock. He had a seizure, a grand mal seizure, and fell into the water unconscious. Even if you'd been standing right next to him, you couldn't have prevented it." The revelation hit Kate like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt of believing her inattention had killed her son. But the truth was that Michael had suffered from an undiagnosed seizure disorder, and his death was a tragic medical event that no amount of parental vigilance could have prevented. "The hospital knew," Marcus continued as the helicopter prepared to depart. They suppressed the footage to avoid a malpractice lawsuit over the missed diagnosis. Kate, you were never responsible for his death. You were scapegoated. As Dorothy was airlifted to the mainland hospital, Kate stood among the debris of Pine Island with Hank, Ranger, and Tommy, processing a truth that fundamentally changed her understanding of the past 3 years. She hadn't killed her son through negligence. She had been the victim of a medical system that chose to blame a grieving mother rather than admit its own failures. The guilt that had driven her to attempt suicide was based on a lie. 6 months after Hurricane Delilah, Kate Sullivan stood in the doorway of the Second Chances Animal Therapy Center, watching Ranger demonstrate his remarkable abilities to a group of visiting veterinary students. The German Shepherd, now officially certified as a therapy dog, was working with a young boy who had been traumatized in a car accident, showing the kind of intuitive understanding that made him legendary among the coastal North Carolina medical community. "He knows exactly what that child needs," said Dr. Sarah Chen, Kate's new partner in the therapy center. "It's like he can read emotional pain the way other dogs smell treats." Kate smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had taken months to develop. The revelation about Michael's true cause of death had lifted the crushing weight of guilt, but healing from 3 years of self-hatred hadn't happened overnight. It had taken therapy, medication, and most importantly, the daily reminder that she was saving lives again rather than planning to end her own. The therapy center occupied a renovated building on the Outer Banks waterfront, just 2 miles from where Pine Island had once stood. The storm had scoured the barrier island down to bedrock, but from its destruction had grown something beautiful. A facility dedicated to helping trauma survivors heal through their connections with animals who understood suffering. "Dr. Sullivan?" The voice belonged to Tommy Williams, now a regular volunteer at the center when he wasn't flying Coast Guard rescue missions. "There's someone here to see you." Kate turned to find Dorothy Peterson in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily with the aid of a walking cane. At 74, Dorothy had survived not only Hurricane Delilah but also the devastating loss of her husband, and her presence at the therapy center always brought Kate a special kind of joy. "Dorothy," Kate exclaimed, embracing the older woman carefully, "how are you feeling today?" "Like a woman who's lived through hell and decided to make something beautiful out of it," Dorothy replied with the directness that had become her trademark. "I wanted to talk to you about the foundation." The Pete Peterson Emergency Medical Response Foundation had been Dorothy's idea, born from the recognition that coastal communities needed better disaster preparedness and trauma care. What had started as a modest memorial to her husband had grown into a regional network of emergency medical stations, staffed by volunteers and funded by donations from hurricane survivors who understood the importance of being ready for the next storm. "The board approved your proposal," Dorothy announced with a smile that lit up her entire face. "We're funding 3 new emergency medical caches on the barrier islands, each equipped with cardiac medication, defibrillators, and satellite communication equipment. No one else should die the way Pete did, waiting for help that couldn't reach them in time." Kate felt tears building behind her eyes, the good kind of tears that came from seeing broken things made whole again. "Dorothy, that's incredible. Pete would be so proud." "He would be," Dorothy agreed. "But he'd be prouder of what you've become. When I met you in that bunker, you were a woman planning to die. Now look at you, saving lives every single day." Through the therapy center's windows, Kate could see Hank Williams working in the harbor, where he now served as coordinator for the Coastal Emergency Response Network. At 68, the retired fisherman had found new purpose in training younger boat captains in storm survival techniques and emergency medical response. His heart condition was well managed now thanks to proper medication and regular medical care that he'd finally accepted. The reconciliation between Hank and Tommy had been one of the most beautiful developments of the past 6 months. Father and son now worked together regularly, with Hank providing maritime wisdom while Tommy contributed his flight experience to search and rescue operations. The gambling addiction that had driven them apart had been addressed through therapy and a structured repayment plan that allowed Tommy to rebuild trust while taking responsibility for his past mistakes. "You know what the best part is?" Dorothy continued, watching Ranger work with another child. "That wonderful dog has helped us understand something important about loyalty and love. He never gave up on you, even when you'd given up on yourself." Kate nodded, remembering the darkest moments in the bunker when Ranger had positioned himself between her and her suicidal thoughts, with the unwavering determination of a guardian angel. "He saved my life in more ways than I can count. And now he's saving other lives," Dorothy observed. "That's what I call a legacy worth living for." The afternoon brought a special visitor that Kate had been both anticipating and dreading. Dr. Marcus Reed, who had delivered the news about Michael's true cause of death, arrived with a thick folder of documents and a somber expression that immediately put Kate on edge. "Kate, I have news about the legal case," he said, settling into a chair in her office while Ranger positioned himself protectively at Kate's feet. "The hospital has agreed to a settlement, but more importantly, they've agreed to policy changes that will prevent this kind of cover-up from happening again." The settlement was substantial, enough to fully fund the therapy center for the next 5 years, but Kate found herself caring more about the systemic changes. What kind of policy changes? Mandatory disclosure of all medical evidence to families, regardless of potential liability. Independent review of all pediatric deaths by outside specialists. And most importantly, a victim advocacy program that provides legal support to families who believe they've been misled about the circumstances of their child's death. Kate closed her eyes, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Michael's death might prevent other families from going through what I went through. "That's exactly right," Marcus confirmed. "Your son's legacy is protecting other children and supporting other families." That has to mean something. That evening, as the therapy center closed for the day, Kate found herself walking along the waterfront with Ranger, following a path that had become their daily ritual. The German Shepherd stayed close to her side, no longer showing the hyper-vigilant behavior that had characterized his early months as her guardian. He seemed to understand that Kate was healing, that the acute phase of her crisis had passed. They stopped at the memorial bench that had been installed overlooking the water, a simple wooden structure with a brass plaque reading, "In memory of all those lost to the sea, and in celebration of those who refused to give up hope." It had become a gathering place for hurricane survivors, a spot where people came to remember the dead and commit to living fully in their honor. "You know what I realized today?" Kate said to Ranger, who tilted his massive head to look at her with those intelligent amber eyes. "I spent 3 years thinking I was being punished for failing Michael. But maybe I was actually being prepared for this, for helping other people heal from trauma." Ranger's tail wagged once, a gesture that Kate had learned meant approval or agreement. The dog's responses had become so nuanced over the months that she sometimes wondered if he understood human language better than most humans understood each other. As the sun set over the outer banks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Kate of hope and renewal, she felt a peace that had eluded her for years. Michael was gone, and that would always be a source of sadness. But his death had meaning now. It had led to changes that would protect other children and to a life dedicated to healing trauma in all its forms. "Tomorrow we start training 3 new therapy dogs," she told Ranger. "Dogs like you, who understand that sometimes the best medicine is simply refusing to leave someone's side when they're in pain." The walk back to Kate's small house was peaceful, marked by the comfortable companionship of a woman and her dog who had learned to trust in the possibility of tomorrow. Hank was waiting on her front porch, as he did most evenings, ready to share dinner and conversation with the unlikely family they had formed from the wreckage of their individual losses. "How was Dorothy today?" he asked as they settled on the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for evening talks. "Triumphant," Kate replied. "The foundation approved funding for 3 new emergency medical stations. Pete's death is going to save lives." "And how are you today?" Hank asked, the question he posed every evening with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that healing wasn't a destination, but a daily journey. Kate considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I'm grateful," she said finally. "Grateful for second chances, for dogs who swim 3 miles to find help, for fishermen who risk their own lives to save strangers, and for the understanding that sometimes the worst things that happen to us prepare us for the best things we'll ever do." Ranger settled at their feet, content in the knowledge that his humans were safe, loved, and committed to living. In the distance, lighthouse beams swept across waters that had taken so much, but had also given them everything that truly mattered: purpose, connection, and the unshakable knowledge that love, in its purest form, could overcome any storm. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as our darkest moments. Harold Williams thought his life was over at 68, widowed, broke, estranged from his son, facing foreclosure on the home he'd shared with his beloved Margaret for 40 years. But when he spotted a German shepherd swimming desperately in storm-tossed waters, that single act of compassion changed everything. The dog led him to Dr. Kate Sullivan, a broken woman planning to end her life on the same island where her son had drowned. What followed was a journey through Hurricane Delilah that transformed 3 shattered souls into an unbreakable family. Kate discovered her son's death wasn't her fault. Medical evidence had been hidden for years. Harold reconciled with his son Tommy, a Coast Guard pilot who'd become the hero his father always knew he could be. Together, they built the Second Chances Animal Therapy Center, turning their pain into purpose. Ranger, the loyal German shepherd who started it all, became a certified therapy dog, proving that sometimes our greatest teachers walk on 4 legs. Their story reminds us that it's never too late for redemption, healing, and new beginnings. Even in our golden years, God still has plans for us that are bigger than our past mistakes. Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that emerged from your darkest hour? What animal companion has shown you the true meaning of unconditional love during difficult times? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.